A wealthy woman tastes a simple plate of pasta at a restaurant and feels an inexplicable connection. But when she discovers the chef behind the flavor, her life takes an unexpected turn as she confronts a past she thought was lost forever. Laura, a woman known for her elegance and success in the business world, decided to take a close friend's recommendation: visit the most popular restaurant in town. It was a sunny afternoon when she entered the place, decorated with warm tones and a cozy atmosphere that contrasted with its sophisticated style. The diners chatted in low voices, and the aroma of spices and fresh herbs filled the air, awakening an unexpected sensation in Laura. A waiter led her to a table near the window, where she could watch the passing of passers-by as she perused the menu. Though the options were varied and refined, something about the pasta dish's description caught her eye. Homemade pasta with special house sauce, it said. It wasn't the most luxurious dish on the menu, but something about its simplicity intrigued her. When the dish arrived, Laura was mesmerized by the presentation. Perfectly served pasta with a creamy sauce that gave off an enveloping aroma. She took the first bite, and a wave of emotions took her by surprise. The taste was deeply familiar, like an echo of a forgotten time. She closed her eyes and, for a moment, found herself in the kitchen of her grandmother, a loving woman who used to cook with her soul. She remembered entire afternoons helping her knead dough and prepare sauces, a part of her life that had been buried under the weight of her current responsibilities. Moved by the intensity of the experience, Laura decided to call the waiter. "Please, may I speak to the chef?" she asked with a smile that tried to hide her excitement. The waiter, surprised but pleased, nodded and left to find him. As she waited, Laura fiddled with her fork, her mind filled with questions. How was it possible that a simple plate of pasta could transport her back to her childhood? Who was the chef behind this culinary miracle? When the waiter returned, he informed her that the chef was busy in the kitchen, but would be happy to meet her at the end of his shift. Laura accepted the wait, feeling strangely impatient. As she looked around the restaurant with new eyes, she noticed details that had previously gone unnoticed. The dedication of the staff, the warmth of the place, and the passion evident in every dish served. There was something special here, something that seemed deeper than just a food business. The rest of the meal passed in silence, with Laura lost in her thoughts. When she finished, she decided to stay a little longer, waiting for that encounter that now seemed crucial to her. She had come looking for a unique gastronomic experience, but what she found was much more personal. Something about this place had awakened a part of her that she thought was lost. At the end of his shift, the chef emerged from the kitchen with firm but calm steps. He was a young man, no more than 30 years old, with an apron stained by the day's work. His dark eyes radiated determination and a peculiar gleam, as if a burning flame was burning inside them. Translated from Spanish to English, www.onlinedoctorandslater.com, unwavering passion. Laura sat in a corner of the restaurant, watching him approach while trying to maintain her composure. There was something about his presence that was eerily familiar. "Good afternoon, madam. I was told you wanted to meet me," the chef said with a friendly smile as he wiped his hands on his apron. Laura stood up gracefully, holding out her hand. "Yes, that's right. My name is Laura. I wanted to congratulate you personally. Your dish has impressed me in a special way." "Thank you," he replied, surprised but grateful for the compliment. "I'm glad you enjoyed it. The recipe is a mix of family traditions and some of my own experimentation." The words echoed through Laura like a distant echo. Family traditions. A shiver ran down her spine as she noticed a detail that had until then gone unnoticed. A small mark on the chef's right hand. It was a scar, almost imperceptible, but its shape was unmistakable. Her heart skipped a beat. "Excuse me," she said, trying to hide her agitation. "May I ask your name?" "Miguel," he replied simply, while looking at her with slight curiosity. Laura felt the air in the restaurant grow thick, making it difficult for her to breathe. Miguel. The last time she had said that name, it had been through tears. Years ago, she had lost her son, Miguel, in circumstances that still weighed on her soul. But could it be him? Was it possible that this young man, with that identical scar and that name that meant so much, was the son she had lost. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Miguel," she said in a shaky voice, trying to regain control of her emotions. Miguel seemed to notice something strange in her expression, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he thanked her for coming and made to go back to the kitchen. Before he left, Laura stopped him. "Excuse me, could we talk more another day? There's something about your cooking, about your way of working, that I'd like to know more about." Miguel raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Of course, ma'am. I'm always here. It'll be a pleasure to talk." Laura watched him disappear behind the door that led to the kitchen, feeling a mixture of emotions that overwhelmed her: joy, uncertainty, and a deep fear of discovering the truth. As she headed towards the exit of the restaurant, an idea began to take shape in her mind. She had to go back. She needed to confirm what her heart was beginning to scream at her loudly. The next few days, Laura found one excuse after another to return to the restaurant. It was no longer about tasting the food, although each dish she ordered was a work of art in itself, but about watching Miguel. From her usual spot, a discreet table next to the window, Laura studied every movement of the young chef, trying to find out more about him without arousing suspicion. Miguel was a perfectionist. Laura noticed it in the way he checked the dishes before they left the kitchen, in the way he gave instructions to his team with a mixture of firmness and patience. There was a passion in him for his job that could not be faked. However, what most caught Laura's attention was his countenance. There was something in his gestures, in the way he slightly frowned when he concentrated, that reminded her of someone, herself, or perhaps of that child she once held in her arms. Laura tried to approach him in subtle ways. Every time Miguel left the kitchen to supervise something in the living room, she took the opportunity to praise his dishes. "Your lasagna is sublime, Miguel. It has a perfect balance of flavors," she commented one day, earning a shy smile from him. "Thank you. I work hard to achieve that balance," Miguel replied, always cordial but not overly effusive. Despite his praise, Miguel seemed to maintain an invisible barrier between them. He wasn't hostile, but there was a wariness in his attitude, as if he was used to keeping people at a distance. This only increased Laura's curiosity. What had this young man been through to be so reserved? On one occasion, as Laura watched the kitchen from her table, she noticed something that touched her deeply. Miguel, in the midst of the hustle and bustle of the kitchen, stopped to help an apprentice who seemed to be struggling with a recipe. The patience with which he explained each step and the encouragement he gave at the end revealed a compassionate side that resonated with Laura. It was as if she could see glimpses of the person her son could have become. Laura's constant presence did not go unnoticed by Miguel. One afternoon, as he approached her table to collect a comment about her dessert, he couldn't help but express his curiosity. "Excuse me if I am indiscreet, madam, but you have been coming here several days in a row. Is there anything in particular that interests you about this place?" Laura, surprised by the question, took a moment to answer. "I guess you could say there's something special about this restaurant. Not just the food, but the atmosphere and the people who make it possible." Miguel looked at her with some intrigue, but didn't press the issue. "I'm glad you feel that way. It's an honor that you appreciate our work." As the days passed, Laura felt a subtle connection forming between the two. It wasn't a close relationship, but every short conversation and smile exchange seemed to bring them a little closer. However, the weight of her secret grew with each visit. Should she tell Miguel what she suspected? Or would it be better to keep watching and waiting for the right moment? Laura knew she couldn't stay in that middle ground forever. There was something about Miguel that called to her, as if the universe had decided to give them a second chance. Laura arrived at the restaurant earlier than usual, eager to find clues that could confirm her suspicions. This time, she didn't just limit herself to observing Miguel from her usual table. Determined to find out more, she began to chat with the restaurant's employees. The morning bustle of the kitchen made the atmosphere less formal, which allowed her to establish a friendly tone with some of the waiters and assistants. "It's a wonderful place," Laura commented to a young waitress as she waited for her coffee. "It seems like everyone here is like family." The waitress, a smiling young woman named Sophia, nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, Miguel is a great leader. He always looks out for all of us, like an older brother. It's inspiring to work with someone like that." Laura noticed the affectionate tone in which he spoke of Miguel, which encouraged her to continue. He must have a great story behind that dedication. Sophia sighed, lowering her voice a little. Yes, but he doesn't usually talk about it. All we know is that he was adopted and grew up in an orphanage. Miguel never met his biological family. Sophia's words hit Laura hard. Although she had already considered that possibility, hearing it from someone else made her suspicions feel more real, more inevitable. Miguel had been adopted, just as her son had been placed for adoption years ago. The confirmation made her chest fill with a mix of pain and hope. It must be a difficult story, Laura said carefully, trying to maintain her composure. It is, but you'll never hear him complain, Sophia continued. Miguel always says that what matters is the present, and that the past doesn't define who you are. Laura thanked Sophia for her time and returned to her table, although she barely managed to touch the food she had ordered. Her mind was filled with memories of that time when she had made the most painful decision of her life. The circumstances that led her to give her son up for adoption were complicated, and although she knew she had acted with the best intentions at the time, regret had accompanied her ever since. Watching Miguel from her spot, Laura felt a dilemma that tore her apart inside. She had to make a choice. She could continue to watch him from a distance, savoring small moments of connection without risking losing him, or she could face her fear and talk to him about his past. That night, as she walked home, Laura reflected on the bits of information she had gathered. Everything pointed to one truth. Miguel could be her son, but how would she confront him? How would she explain the reasons that led her to abandon him? And, more importantly, how would he react? Laura knew that the time for waiting was over. Miguel deserved to know the truth, even if it meant facing her rejection. Laura arrived at the restaurant with a clear purpose, even though her heart was pounding. It was time to face Miguel and tell him about her past. She had rehearsed the words in her mind hundreds of times, but none of them seemed enough for what she was about to reveal. Miguel was busy in the kitchen, but upon seeing her, he left one of his assistants in charge and went out to greet her. "Mrs. Laura," he said in his usual friendly tone, "what brings you here today?" "We need to talk, Miguel," she replied in a more serious tone than usual. "Could we sit down for a moment? It's important." Miguel looked at her curiously but nodded. Leading her to a secluded table, he removed his apron and sat down opposite her. Laura took a deep breath, trying to calm the whirlwind of emotions that was overwhelming her. "I want to know more about you," Laura began cautiously. "About your life before you came here." Miguel leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression hardening a little. "Why the interest, ma'am? I don't usually talk about my past." "I understand," Laura said softly, "but I feel it's important. Would you mind sharing something? How did you become the talented chef you are today?" Miguel hesitated but finally answered. "I grew up in an orphanage," he said candidly. "I never knew my birth parents. I was adopted when I was about 6, but it wasn't an easy experience. My adoptive parents were good, but I always felt like something was missing." Laura felt her hands shaking, but she kept her composure. "It must have been difficult," she said, her voice filled with empathy. "It was," Miguel continued, glancing briefly toward the window. "But the kitchen was my refuge. I started cooking as a teenager, and from then on I knew this was what I wanted to do." There was a tense silence between them. Laura struggled to find the right words, afraid that anything she said might break the fragile connection they had begun to form. Finally, she gathered the courage she needed. "Miguel," she began in a shaky voice, "there's something I need to tell you. Something I've suspected since I first tasted your cooking." Miguel looked at her carefully, but also cautiously. "What thing?" Laura took a deep breath. "I think you could be my son." Miguel's face froze, as if he was trying to process what he had just heard. His posture changed, and the warmth in his gaze was replaced by a mix of surprise and distrust. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice thick with disbelief. "When I was young, I made a terrible decision," Laura explained, tears in her eyes. "I had to give you up for adoption. I was young, I was alone, and I thought it was the best thing for you. But I never stopped looking for you. I never stopped thinking about you." Miguel stood up from the table, shaking his head. This can't be true. Why now? Why here?" "Miguel, I know this is a lot to take in," Laura said, trying to remain calm. "But please listen to me. I'm not here to justify myself, but to ask for a chance to get to know each other. Miguel did not respond immediately. His eyes showed a mixture of pain and suppressed rage. Finally, in a cold tone, he said, "I need time." Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the kitchen. Laura was left alone at the table, heartbroken but determined to give him the space he needed. Laura spent the next few days in a state of anxiety and regret. She didn't know if Miguel would ever speak to her again, or if she had lost him forever with her confession. Every night she replayed the conversation over and over, wondering if she could have said something different to soften the impact. However, she knew she couldn't turn back. She had done what she thought was right by telling him the truth, but now it was all in Miguel's hands. One afternoon, as she sat in her living room over a cup of cold tea she'd forgotten to drink, her phone rang. It was a message from the restaurant. At first, her heart raced, but as she opened it, she realized it wasn't Miguel writing. It was Sophia, the waitress, informing her that Miguel had asked for a few days off. Laura felt a pang of guilt as she read it. He was taking time to process what he'd heard, and there was nothing she could do but wait. Meanwhile, Miguel had left the city, driving without a clear destination. He needed to escape the emotional turmoil that was consuming him. Laura's words echoed in his mind over and over again. "I think you could be my son." At first, his reaction had been one of disbelief. The idea that a rich, elegant woman like Laura could be his biological mother seemed absurd. But the more he thought about it, the more doubts arose. He stopped at a small roadside cafe. As he sipped a bitter coffee, his mind filled with memories of his childhood. The lonely nights at the orphanage, the unanswered questions about his origins, and the constant feeling that something was missing. All of that was now intertwined with the image of Laura, her pain-filled eyes and her trembling voice as she told him the truth. He returned to the city 2 days later, determined to confront his emotions. He couldn't ignore what had happened, but he wasn't ready to forgive or accept what Laura had told him either. He needed answers, but more than anything, he needed to understand. One evening after closing the restaurant, Miguel decided to look for Laura. He didn't call her or text her. He simply showed up at her apartment door, hands in his pockets and a serious expression on his face. Laura opened the door, surprised but also relieved to see him. "Miguel," she said, barely containing her emotions. "I need to hear your full version," he said, his tone direct. "I want to understand why you made that decision. I'm not promising anything, but I want to know." Laura nodded, inviting him in. She led him into the living room, where they sat face to face. For what seemed like hours, Laura told him her story. She told him about her youth, about the difficulties she faced alone, about how social and economic pressure led her to make a decision that still tormented her. Miguel listened in silence, his face impassive, even though inside he felt a whirlwind of emotions. For the first time, he saw Laura not as a distant, perfect figure, but as a human woman with mistakes and regrets. When Laura finished, her eyes were filled with tears. "I know there's no excuse for what I did," she said, her voice breaking. "But if there's anything you can ask of me to make amends, I will. I just want you to know that I always looked out for you, and I never stopped loving you." Miguel didn't respond right away. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the city lights as he processed what he had just heard. Finally, he spoke. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet, but I think I want to try. I need time, but I'm willing to give you a chance to prove your point." Laura felt a surge of relief at hearing those words. It wasn't the complete forgiveness she had hoped for, but it was a start. After their intense conversation, Laura and Miguel decided to keep a safe distance. Laura, respecting Miguel's desire to process what he had heard, avoided showing up at the restaurant or contacting him directly. Miguel, for his part, immersed his mind in work, using the routine of the kitchen as a way to distract himself from the emotional chaos he was feeling. But the truth was inescapable. On lonely nights, as he closed up the restaurant, Miguel found himself recalling fragments of Laura's story. Her words echoed in his mind, the pain, the regret, the hope for redemption. Although he wanted to maintain the emotional barrier he had built up over the years, something inside him was beginning to weaken. To seek clarity, Miguel decided to share his thoughts with someone he trusted. Sophia. One night after closing, they sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee. Coffee. What would you do if someone from your past showed up and changed everything you thought you knew about your life? Miguel asked, trying to sound casual. Sophia, surprised by the question, looked at him carefully. It depends, she replied. Is that person being honest with you? Miguel nodded slowly. Yes, I think it is. But it's not that easy. This person abandoned me when I needed her the most. Sophia sighed. Miguel, we all make mistakes. If she's trying to make up for what she did, maybe you should give her a chance. Not for her, but for yourself. Maybe you'll discover something that will help you heal. Sophia's words stayed with Miguel for days. Although he still felt resentment toward Laura, he also knew that holding on to anger would get him nowhere. He decided that if he wanted to understand his place in this new reality, he had to face it with maturity. Meanwhile, Laura also sought emotional support. On a rainy afternoon, she visited her best friend Clara, a wise woman who had been her confidant for years. I don't know if I did the right thing by confessing the truth, Laura told her as she watched the rain fall outside the window. Maybe I ruined everything. Clara took her hand tenderly. Laura, you faced your greatest fear and told him the truth. That's an act of love. Now it's all up to him. Give him time, but don't lose hope. Both, in their respective worlds, began to reflect on the steps to follow. Miguel knew that he had to decide if he wanted to build a relationship with Laura while she prepared herself for whatever decision he made, even if it meant removing her from his life forever. One evening, while reviewing the restaurant's accounts, Miguel made a decision. I want to understand more, he thought. That evening, he sent a brief message to Laura. Can you come to the restaurant tomorrow? I think we should talk more. Laura read the message with a mixture of relief and nervousness. It was a small step, but it was what they needed to continue this complex story. Laura arrived at the restaurant the next day, feeling a mixture of anxiety and hope. Miguel was waiting for her at one of the tables in the back, away from the hustle and bustle. When he saw her enter, he looked up, and although his expression was serious, there was no hostility in his eyes. Thanks for coming, Miguel said, pointing to the chair in front of him. Laura sat down, trying not to show how nervous she was. Thank you for giving me this opportunity, she replied, her voice soft but firm. Miguel took a deep breath, as if trying to gather his thoughts before speaking. I've been thinking a lot about everything you said to me, he began. I'm not going to lie, it still hurts. But I also want to understand. I don't want to carry this resentment around forever. Laura nodded, feeling a weight lift slightly from her chest. That's all I hope for, Miguel. That we can talk. No pressure. I'm here to answer any questions you have. Miguel stared at her for a moment before continuing. I want to know, why did you decide to look for me now? After all these years, why are you showing up at this point in my life? Laura looked down, taking a moment before answering. The truth is, I never stopped looking for you, she confessed. There were many times when I thought I wouldn't find you, that I would never have the chance to explain to you what happened. But when I tasted that plate of pasta, something in me knew. I knew there was a connection, something stronger than chance. Miguel remained silent, letting her words sink in. Finally, he said, I don't know if I can call you mom yet. It's a word I've never used, not even with my adoptive parents. But I want to get to know more about you, and I want you to get to know me too. Miguel's words brought tears to Laura's eyes. That's all I could ask for, she said, smiling weakly. As the conversation progressed, the two began to talk about their lives. Laura told him more details about the years she spent searching for him, the decisions she had made, and how each of them had led her to the moment when their paths crossed again. Miguel, though still cautious, began to share his own memories. His time in the orphanage, the challenges he faced in building his career, and the moments of loneliness that sometimes overwhelmed him. The conversation flowed for hours, and although the wounds did not heal immediately, they both began to build a bridge between them. Before leaving, Miguel stood up and said, I think there's still a lot to talk about, but this is a good start. Maybe we can find a way to move forward, step by step. Laura nodded, a mix of relief and gratitude. Thank you, Miguel. You don't know how much this means to me. As Laura walked out of the restaurant that night, she realized that for the first time in years, she felt real hope. She knew the road ahead would be long, but she also knew it would be worth it. The air in the restaurant had a different feel that night. Miguel had closed early, inviting Laura in for a more intimate conversation. Although there was still some tension between them, time and shared words were beginning to smooth out the rough edges of their relationship. Laura arrived on time, dressed simply, leaving aside her usual ostentatious elegance. She knew that this meeting was crucial, not only for her, but for the bond that was just beginning to form with Miguel. He was waiting for her in the kitchen, surrounded by utensils and aromas that seemed to tell their story. "I wanted this meeting to be different," Miguel said, pointing to a small table set up in the kitchen. There were 2 dishes carefully served, accompanied by a bottle of wine. "I thought it would be more appropriate for us to meet here, in the place that means so much to me." Laura smiled, touched by the gesture. "It's perfect," she said, taking a seat. As they began to eat dinner, Miguel started the conversation. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said about the circumstances that led you to make that decision. I know it wasn't easy for you, but I also know that for me, growing up without answers was very painful." Laura looked down, listening intently to every word. "I understand," she replied softly. "I never wanted you to feel that emptiness. If I could go back and change it all, I would do it without hesitation." Miguel sighed, taking a sip of wine. "We can't change the past, but maybe we can build something new. I want to try, Laura. I want to understand who you are, beyond what happened before." Miguel's words resonated with an intensity that almost overwhelmed Laura. "That means more than you can imagine," she said, fighting back tears. The conversation flowed with unexpected warmth. They talked about their tastes, their dreams, and the little details that made up their lives. Miguel shared memories of his early years in the kitchen, the moments when his passion for gastronomy gave him purpose. Laura, for her part, talked about her childhood, about how she had always dreamed of a family that she now felt she could get back. At one point, Miguel stood up and brought out a small, worn notebook. "This is something I kept since I was a kid," he explained, opening it to reveal recipes written in childlike handwriting. "I wrote down everything I could remember of the flavors that made me happy. I think in some way I was always looking for something that connected me to a home I didn't know." Laura looked at the notebook with tears in her eyes. "Miguel," she said, her voice breaking, "what you were looking for was always within you. You are an incredible man, and you don't know how much I regret not being there to see it." Miguel stared at her for a moment before continuing. "I want to know, why did you decide to look for me now? After all these years, why are you showing up at this point in my life?" Laura looked down, taking a moment before answering. "The truth is, I never stopped looking for you," she confessed. "There were many times when I thought I wouldn't find you, that I would never have the chance to explain to you what happened. But when I tasted that plate of pasta, something in me knew. I knew there was a connection, something stronger than chance." Miguel remained silent, letting her words sink in. Finally, he said, "I don't know if I can call you mom yet. It's a word I've never used, not even with my adoptive parents. But I want to get to know more about you, and I want you to get to know me too." Miguel's words brought tears to Laura's eyes. "That's all I could ask for," she said, smiling weakly. As the conversation progressed, the two began to talk about their lives. Laura told him more details about the years she spent searching for him, the decisions she had made, and how each of them had led her to the moment when their paths crossed again. Miguel, though still cautious, began to share his own memories. His time in the orphanage, the challenges he faced in building his career, and the moments of loneliness that sometimes overwhelmed him. The conversation flowed for hours, and although the wounds did not heal immediately, they both began to build a bridge between them. Before leaving, Miguel stood up and said, "I think there's still a lot to talk about, but this is a good start. Maybe we can find a way to move forward, step by step." Laura nodded, a mix of relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Miguel. You don't know how much this means to me." As Laura walked out of the restaurant that night, she realized that for the first time in years, she felt real hope. She knew the road ahead would be long, but she also knew it would be worth it. The air in the restaurant had a different feel that night. Miguel had closed early, inviting Laura in for a more intimate conversation. Although there was still some tension between them, time and shared words were beginning to smooth out the rough edges of their relationship. Laura arrived on time, dressed simply, leaving aside her usual ostentatious elegance. She knew that this meeting was crucial, not only for her, but for the bond that was just beginning to form with Miguel. He was waiting for her in the kitchen, surrounded by utensils and aromas that seemed to tell their story. "I wanted this meeting to be different," Miguel said, pointing to a small table set up in the kitchen. There were 2 dishes carefully served, accompanied by a bottle of wine. "I thought it would be more appropriate for us to meet here, in the place that means so much to me." Laura smiled, touched by the gesture. "It's perfect," she said, taking a seat. As they began to eat dinner, Miguel started the conversation. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said about the circumstances that led you to make that decision. I know it wasn't easy for you, but I also know that for me, growing up without answers was very painful." Laura looked down, listening intently to every word. "I understand," she replied softly. "I never wanted you to feel that emptiness. If I could go back and change it all, I would do it without hesitation." Miguel sighed, taking a sip of wine. "We can't change the past, but maybe we can build something new. I want to try, Laura. I want to understand who you are, beyond what happened before." Miguel's words resonated with an intensity that almost overwhelmed Laura. "That means more than you can imagine," she said, fighting back tears. The conversation flowed with unexpected warmth. They talked about their tastes, their dreams, and the little details that made up their lives. Miguel shared memories of his early years in the kitchen, the moments when his passion for gastronomy gave him purpose. Laura, for her part, talked about her childhood, about how she had always dreamed of a family that she now felt she could get back. At one point, Miguel stood up and brought out a small, worn notebook. "This is something I kept since I was a kid," he explained, opening it to reveal recipes written in childlike handwriting. "I wrote down everything I could remember of the flavors that made me happy. I think in some way I was always looking for something that connected me to a home I didn't know." Laura looked at the notebook with tears in her eyes. "Miguel," she said, her voice breaking, "what you were looking for was always within you. You are an incredible man, and you don't know how much I regret not being there to see it." Before they said goodbye that night, Miguel held Laura's hand for the first time. "I don't know what this will be like," he said with an honesty that touched Laura deeply, "but I want to try." Laura smiled, her eyes shining with tears of relief. "That's all I need, Miguel. One step at a time." Sunlight streamed softly through the restaurant windows, filling the space with a warm morning glow. Laura arrived early, invited by Miguel for a special occasion. It had been several weeks since their last meaningful conversation, and little by little, the two had begun to build a bridge of trust. Miguel greeted her at the door, wearing his impeccable chef's apron and with a more relaxed smile than in previous encounters. "Today is an important day," he said as he led her into the kitchen. "What do you have planned?" Laura asked, intrigued, as she looked at the table already set with a single plate in the center, covered with a metal bell. "I want to share something with you," Miguel replied as he stood in front of her. "This plate is special. It represents everything I am, everything I've been through, and what I want this new beginning to mean." Gently, he lifted the bell, revealing a simple but perfectly presented plate of pasta, bathed in a sauce that gave off a familiar aroma. Laura recognized it instantly. It was the same dish she had ordered the first time she visited the restaurant. "Do you remember?" Miguel asked. "How could I forget it?" Laura said, touched. "It was what awakened all those memories and brought me here." Miguel nodded, smiling. "This dish has always had a special meaning for me. The recipe comes from a memory that I didn't know where it came from, something that always made me feel at home. Now I know that this flavor is part of you, part of us." Laura picked up her fork with trembling hands and took the first bite. It was exactly as she remembered, a taste full of warmth, nostalgia, and love. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to enjoy the moment, as tears rolled down her face. "It's perfect, Miguel," she whispered, "not just for the taste, but for what it means." Miguel sat down across from her, and the two of them shared the meal in silence, letting the moment speak for itself. There was something powerful in that simple gesture, as if each bite represented a renewed connection between them. When they were done, Miguel took Laura's hand and said sincerely, "I know we can't make up for lost time, but I want to look forward. I want this to be the beginning of something new for both of us." Laura smiled, feeling a mix of relief and hope. "That's all I've ever wanted, Miguel. A new beginning." with you. That afternoon, as they walked together toward the restaurant's exit, the relationship that had once been broken now felt full of possibility. Laura knew the road would not be easy, and there would still be challenges. But she also knew that with each step they took together, the bond between mother and son would grow stronger. As they closed the door to the restaurant, Miguel paused for a moment and looked at Laura. "Thank you for never giving up," he said with a sincerity that touched her heart. "Thank you for giving me this opportunity," she replied, taking his hand. The sun was beginning to set on the horizon, illuminating the beginning of a new stage in their lives. Not everything had been said, but the most important thing had begun. A relationship built on understanding, forgiveness, and love. History teaches us that sometimes the past comes back to give us a second chance, but it is up to us to face it bravely and learn to forgive, even when the pain seems insurmountable. What would you have done in Laura's place? Would you have looked for someone you left behind, or would you prefer not to reopen past wounds? Reflect on how these decisions can change lives. Click on the video on the screen to continue this fascinating journey of self-discovery and explore more stories that inspire us to grow and reconnect with our emotions. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss content full of lessons and emotions like this one. See you in the next video.